Fantastic. So really lovely to have you all join us for what is our third and final panel in the Psychological Secrets of Writing series. I am really delighted to have Gabriella Braun and Mick Finlay with me today, or this evening. We'll start by just briefly introducing ourselves so you know a little bit about who we are and what we're all about. So I am Philippa East. I'm a psychological suspense author with HQ HarperCollins, and my books in order are Little White Lies, Safe and Sound, and my next one coming out in January, which is the proof copy here, is called I'll Never Tell. In my day job, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I nowadays work in private practice, seeing adult clients for one-to-one therapy. And Melissa, my cat, was around, but she's gone out again, but I'm hoping that she may come back later on. So everybody keep fingers crossed that Mimi the cat does come and join us at some point. So yeah. Okay, and again, just a reminder to everyone to mute themselves and to switch off their cameras, and we'll be good. Hang on a sec, let me just check that everybody is muted. Oh, hang on, here we go. I found them. I can always spot the person who hasn't got themselves muted, and then I mute them. Okay, Mick, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Philippa. I'm Mick Finlay, and I write the Arrowood books, which are crime mysteries set in London in the 1890s. And there have been 4 so far. The first being Arrowood, and the last one, published last year, Arrowood and the Meeting House Murders. And I am also a psychologist, but I'm not a therapist. And many clinical psychologists would not even consider me a psychologist.
What?
But I am a social psychologist, and I have been doing research into psychological issues in universities and teaching in psychology in universities for quite a few years. And my speciality is social psychology, which is the psychology of groups and identity and social interactions and communication. So I've done lots of research in those areas. And before I did that, I spent 5 years working in social services and in psychology departments in the NHS with adults with learning disabilities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. I've got that already just makes me have so many questions I want to ask you. Just to say, I remember doing my social psychology modules in my undergrad, and I really, really enjoyed social psychology. Obviously, I was just doing it at undergrad level, and obviously you'll have so much more expertise, but I still think a lot about the social psychology principles that I learned then, even in my clinical practice, because it's, particularly when I work with people who have things like social anxiety, and being able to explain to them a little bit about how groups of people work, I think it's, it's great. I love it. So I definitely see you as a psychologist, don't worry.
Thank you.
And Gabriella, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I would. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see so many people here, and actually also some names that I know from years ago and not from Twitter. So that's really nice to see people. And Philippa, thank you for doing this and inviting me. So I'm Gabriella Braun. I'm really not a psychologist. I'm a real not psychologist. I apply psychoanalysis and systems thinking to working with groups. So I very much use the psychoanalytic approach to thinking about groups, and working with teams in organizations. And my book is All That We Are. The subtitle is Uncovering the Hidden Truths Behind Our Behaviour at Work. I think, yes, I always forget my subtitle. That is the subtitle. And it's basically narrative nonfiction. So it's stories about, based on my work, about what happens to us in the workplace, and using a psychological lens, a psychoanalytic lens. And I'm now trying to write a novel.
We're all trying, Gabriella. Fantastic. So to kick us off, I mean, perhaps a little bit, you know, from what we've each said, this we've maybe partly answered this question already, but one of the things that I asked other panelists is, what came first for you, writing or the psychology world? Now, I know that you said, Gabriella, your qualification isn't psychologist, but, you know, working in the field of therapy, psychoanalysis, this kind of thing. So do you want to say a little bit about that, Gabriella? You know, is writing only something that you've come to at this sort of stage in your life, or was it something that was part of your life much earlier, and then your training in psychoanalysis got in the way, or how did it work for you?
I mean, I'm a very late developer with writing, so it came very late for me, and the psychoanalytic bit came much earlier. But I think actually, in a way, I've gone back to something. As a child, I loved writing stories, and I think I lost that for decades and decades and decades. I did a degree in English. You know, I always loved books, and reading was incredibly important to me. But I think oh, thank you. Somebody said they love late developers. My book was published, I can't remember how old I was. I think I was 63 when it was published. No, I must have been 64. No, I was 65 when it was. Oh God. The paperback's coming out in February, when I'll be 66. So I'm seriously a late developer. But as I say, I think in a way, I've finally gone back to something. And the psychoanalytic bit, to me, is really very well paired with writing.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I feel very similarly to you, Gabriella, about, you know, just I describe them as two sides of the same coin for me. What about you, Mick? What's the chronology been for you in terms of discovering your passion for psychology versus discovering your passion for writing?
Well, I'm also a late developer, Gabriella.
Oh, good.
But actually, compared to 65 years old, I was almost a child. I was in my early 50s though when I was first published. But I from a teenager used to try and write songs. I loved Bob Dylan, and I wanted to be Bob Dylan, and I wrote songs, and I wrote loads of songs. They're not awful songs I wrote, but so I wasn't very good at it. But I did continue doing it for quite a few years, and so I guess that was a writing, although a very different type of writing to novel writing. But yeah, no. Then I didn't start writing novels and short stories until after I got a PhD in psychology. So that was the way it worked for me.
And I remember my first foray into fiction writing, which for me was just another foray into another creative hobby I was dabbling with. I was like, oh, why don't I try writing a novel? But do you remember how, obviously it sounds like your careers, even if you'd both explored writing and stories or poetry and songwriting as children or teenagers, it sounds like your sort of serious professional careers were, in the world of, psychology, therapy and so on. But do you remember the moment where you came back to writing, or you discovered the writing that then became your publishing career? Mick, do you want to say bit about that? Was it a moment, or was it a gradual, how did it come about for you?
I really don't know, but I do know that there was a I suppose there was this time slot presented to me, which I could write in that when my son was born, me and my then wife had would sort of take turns to do it, and so I would work some days at the weekend and take some of the daytimes, and we would sort of share it out that way. So when I was looking after him during the week, there were certain slots when he went to sleep in the day, and I would sort of desperate not just to be a dad at home. I was desperate to do something in that time, even though it was extremely tiring. But funnily enough, it was quite energizing to sort of say, okay, I've got an hour now, and get down, see what you can do. And it started that way for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was something that you needed something else to be putting your personal energies into, as well as, when you were bringing up your infant. And what about you, Gabriella? Do you remember a moment or how it came about that you dived back into writing again?
Mine was very clear, actually. I got an absolute bee in my bonnet about the way consultants to organisations in my discipline, applying psychoanalytic thinking and systems thinking, are very we don't take it out into the world. I think we're really bad at taking it out into the world. It's a very closed shop, really. And I decided to run a seminar series for anyone who wanted to come. And that went really well. So it was leadership and psychoanalysis. What have they got to do with each other? And people could come to a seminar on leadership and love, or leadership and aggression, or whatever it was. And very quickly then I thought, this is a book. There's a book in this. And then I was so naive about writing and about books that I was quite clear that I'd done a huge amount of work for the seminars, huge amount, and that I'd done 9 seminars. So there it was. I had 9 chapters for a book. No, it didn't work like that at all. A seminar did not convert into a chapter. That was a bit of a stumbling block. But that was my moment.
Yeah.
And then more and more, I got very keen on, to my surprise, actually, I got really keen on the craft of writing.
Yeah, and actually, we were talking a little bit about this before we came on air, weren't we? But I would love to hear you say a little bit more about, I suppose, for want of a better word, the genre that you work in, which you describe as narrative nonfiction. To date, all the other panelists we've had on this have been fiction writers of one kind or another. Interestingly, a lot of crime and thriller writers. There's clearly something about psychologists and therapists that they want to write about the dark stuff. But I suppose I've got a question that's got maybe 2 or 3 parts to it. So sorry if this is a bit of a humdinger, but first of all, it'd be great if you could explain to us a little bit more your understanding of what we mean by narrative nonfiction, because those 2 terms sound like they contradict each other, but obviously it's a well-recognized genre. And also, I think, what kind of story principles narrative story principles you've drawn on to shape and structure your non-fiction book. And then the third bit of it, I suppose, is this is kind of like a big loopy one, but does your expertise as a therapist, a psychoanalytic therapist, inform your understanding of story craft? So not just your understanding of the work that you do, obviously, of course, you understand the work that you do, and that's what you're writing about, but does your expertise in psychoanalysis also link to your understanding of story principles as well? Sorry, that was quite a convoluted question, but it's all kind of tied together.
Yeah, great question. So starting with what I understand by narrative nonfiction. Okay. So narrative nonfiction, I think, is using storytelling for your non-fiction. So my book is absolutely not academic. I was very clear I didn't want to write an academic book. I wanted to make this kind of thinking accessible to people generally, and academic books are by definition not for a broad audience. So I didn't want to do that. So actually I do have theory in my book, but it's not done in an academic way. I think it's very accessible. So I use storytelling. It's also very much a book. I mean, you could write for what we'd call a mainstream publisher, but you still end up with kind of tips, a kind of how to. Maybe at the end of each chapter, you'd say, now go away and do this, and why don't you think about that? And there are some excellent books like that, and lots of people love that. You wouldn't call that narrative nonfiction, I don't think. So mine is basically, I tell stories that are based on case studies, and I leave the reader with the story. And I don't necessarily, I do analyze it, because I'm a protagonist in the book, as it were. I'm the character that goes from beginning to end. And I think that's also part of narrative nonfiction. There's got to be a follow through of a character. So as I'm writing, I'm telling the reader some of what I'm thinking, and I am analysing what's happening in the situation, but I don't necessarily give completely neat wrap-ups. So I think that's the bit of the storytelling. Philippa, what was the next bit of your question?
Yeah. So I think, so you've kind of answered some of it already. Like, I was thinking about, as fiction writers, there's certain kind of building blocks of craft, so to speak, that we can learn about, like point of view, or how to structure a scene, or are there particular storytelling principles that you particularly were aware of? Like you mentioned, for example, thinking of yourself as a protagonist going through the story. Are there other elements of traditional story craft and story kind of techniques that you were aware of, particularly kind of including to make it this narrative book rather than this sort of textbook or how-to book?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for reminding me. There are particular things. I think there are things like use of the senses that you wouldn't usually have in non-fiction that isn't narrative non-fiction. So I bring in the use of the senses quite a lot. I'll have quite a lot of description. I mean, that's very important to me in my work. It's true to my work. But if I was writing an academic book, I cut all that out. Whereas I absolutely put it in the scenes. I also think about story arc, and I think so this also relates to the third part of your question, which is the understanding of psychoanalysis to the art of writing. So the structure of my book follows a kind of psychoanalytic view of human development. Like, I have the fundamentals first of human nature, then I have the destructiveness, the way we can go down into really destructive areas, and then the constructive parts of us, which is how psychoanalytically we think people develop. Like, the difficult stuff comes first.
That's absolutely fascinating, Gabriella. I love that, because one of the things I think a lot about, I suppose from my psychology background and thinking about story arcs, is, and we talked about this in one of the other panels, I use the model of stages of grief, or which I also think of as stages of loss and change. And I think a lot about how the hero's journey maps onto the stages of denial, anger bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it's really interesting that you have a sort of model within the psychoanalytic field, which is different. It sounds different, but you're also using that to map a process of human development and tying that in. Yeah, I mean, when I read your book, Gabriella, which and for everyone out there, go and get it. It's fantastic. It felt like every every chapter was like a short story in a way that had that sense of beginning, middle and end and a point to it.
Yeah.
And I think it was such a lovely way to read these case studies, you know, and I think it just works so brilliantly. Yeah.
I did definitely want them to read like a short story, and I definitely use things from fiction like building tension, judging when to let certain information out, which you wouldn't necessarily do in other kinds of non-fiction. You just tell it more factually. Whereas I was thinking, oh, hang on, no, I need the reader to not know this yet, because it'll keep them more gripped. The kinds of things that you're thinking about all the time in novel writing, but I don't think necessarily think about in other forms of non-fiction.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. So Mick, I want to come to you. You've obviously sitting there very patiently. Well, I think
it's fascinating. I'm listening.
Deep dive into Gabriella. And it's this panel. I'm really enjoying this panel because in the other ones we've had quite a wealth of clinical psychologists, which is great. You know, I'm all for the clinical psychologist. Obviously, I'm a clinical psychologist. But it's really nice having this panel because I think we're all so different, but we have the overlaps in the sense that, you know, Mick, you and I are both psychologists, but I'm clinical, you're a social psychologist. And then Gabriella and Mick, you both focus a lot on, you know, groups and group dynamics, but from very different perspectives. So Mick, I wanted to ask you a little bit, or just to say a little bit about how, two things really. One is how, or do you draw on your knowledge and expertise of the principles of social psychology to help you write your books, whether that's your characters or whether that's their interactions, or for example, maybe how you set up conflict in your books? And also, I was wondering, because your Arrowwood series it's historical crime, isn't it? And it's set in Victorian England. And actually, what I have just had to say this about Mick's book, which I thought was just the cleverest thing. Mick's books with his detective are set contemporaneously with Sherlock Holmes. Is that right? That's right, isn't it? But,
yes.
But Sherlock Holmes is like the kind of, you know, he's the sort of glamorous detective over there. And then you've got Arrowwood, who's a very different kind of character doing his own types of investigatings alongside. I just thought that's such a great idea. But I wondered again, as a historical fiction writer in the crime genre, is there anything from your background as a social psychologist that's helped you to write historical fiction as well as to write fiction more generally?
Yeah, well, actually, yes. And there's a very, very close link in that to create a sort of a nemesis for Sherlock Holmes, who's Arrowwood, I wanted him to be the opposite of Sherlock Holmes. And now Sherlock Holmes famously is not interested in psychology at all, or motive. He's not interested in people. So I wanted William Arrowwood to be fascinated by people. And so what I get him doing is constantly reading the Victorian ideas of psychology and trying to use those ideas to help him solve cases. So it allowed me to sort of delve into the history of psychology. So he, for example, is very keen on this idea of emotional contagion, which Gustave Le Bon, who wrote a book about the psychology of crowds at the time, believed that that's how crowds became unruly and uncontrollable, is because there was some form of emotional contagion, which he thought was through processes of animal magnetism, which are these sort of invisible currents that go through the air between people. And so Arrowwood, for example, when he's interrogating somebody or he's investigating a crime scene, believes that he's picking up on people's emotions. You know, in fact, he probably is, in the way that we all do subconsciously, by being aware of people's nonverbal behaviors and things like this and the tone of speech. We might be putting all the clues together and thinking, oh, I think this person is this because of this, but we do it anyway. So Arrowwood's probably doing that. So he's using the wrong kind of psychological theory, but he's still doing it. So yeah, and it's like the criminal psychology at the time was about being able to identify criminals from people's facial features. And so, you know, that allowed me to put some policemen in there who were, you know, making assumptions about who was the criminal based on the size of their ears or the heaviness of their jaw, for example. One interesting one, arsonists were thought to have effeminate speech and luxuriant hair, and that was how you identified an arsonist. But there's a whole range of other theories that he starts to use and play around with, and it's been a really interesting process trying to find out what the Victorians actually believed about human psychology.
Yeah, I love that. And were there certain theories from that time that you came across which, like you say, perhaps they were using different terminology, or their theoretical framework was different, but actually you recognize it as something that we do validate now? Like, okay, we probably don't validate the physical characteristics of arsonists, but it's interesting, like clearly maybe what they called animal magnetism was, or I don't know, I mean, because we talk about, they've got the thing of I was listening to something the other day about mass psychogenic, what's they called again? But basically what we used to call mass hysteria. So it's they've got another word for it now, psychosocial, something like that. But the idea of, so basically my question is, were there things that they were identifying back then that they may have labeled differently to us, but which we can still recognize as valid psychological phenomenon?
Yeah, they knew a lot more about psychology than I guess we think they did. So, for example, they had the idea of the unconscious before Freud. Gabriella will know about this. Freud didn't invent the unconscious. There were people for centuries before that who had ideas about the unconscious, and Victorian sort of philosophers, psychologists were writing about something called the subliminal unconscious. Arrowood is around at the time Freud started to publish his first works in German, and Freud was very much using those ideas. Hypnotism was a really big thing at the time, and they were coming up with categorizations of mental illnesses, which are, which we label differently now, but a lot of the basic sort of classification systems are very similar. So they had this idea of monomania at the time, and they could have emotional monomania, was when somebody was completely captured by a certain emotion of theirs and they just couldn't control it. And I can't remember, moral monomania, which is when you were captivated by a certain idea or perception of the world. And those sort of things do map on to certain things like delusions, and a lot of we still have a lot of words that end in mania, like pyromania and nymphomania and kleptomania
and mania.
And mania, yeah.
Yeah.
And there were all these psychologists around the Western world, particularly, developing their own classification systems, borrowing on each other's ideas, but all working towards. Maudsley in the UK was, had a very comprehensive system of classification of mental illnesses. So they were doing they are the bedrock of where we are now, obviously. So they were doing a lot right. Maybe more sophisticated now, but yeah, they were doing a lot right.
Yeah.
So it's great. It is great as a psychologist writing in historical fiction, because it allows me to try and think my way back into the way in which they saw things around psychology in those days.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, actually. I think maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think sometimes one of the things we are not always great at doing is looking back historically as psychologists, because sometimes I think we reinvent the wheel. Do you know what I mean? Like we kind of, I don't know, it's like we continually relabel disorders like a new way each time, but it's the same thing, and yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and William James, who wrote The Principles of Psychology at the same time. Wow. I mean, so many of those principles are the principles of cognitive psychology nowadays.
Yeah.
So they really were. Well, how about you, Philippa? Why don't you tell us a bit about how you integrate psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a little bit, like I said before, I use it to think a lot about my story structure. And particularly as a therapist, I think that the kind of arc that I see clients go on in successful therapy, now there is such a thing as not very successful therapy, of course, maps so fascinatingly to me onto the kind of, like I say, the hero's journey. So, you know, people come to therapy because there's been some sort of major inciting incident in their life which has disrupted their status quo, and they're all at sea. And the kind of the main bit of the story is the kind of tussle with the denial, the anger, the bargaining, not knowing how to deal with this thing and resisting this thing and being in conflict with this thing, or bringing up conflicts. The depression phase is what in story terms we might call the all is lost moment. And then sort of in story terms, the sort of death and rebirth is moving into that acceptance phase, which is when you've set up a new status quo for yourself beyond that event. So I find
I've got a delivery's just arrived.
Oh yeah, you dash. And I will blabber on. He can check it out on YouTube. And then I think I use it a lot in terms of my character development and that kind of thing, you know, in terms of understanding, you know, what motivates people, how people might typically react to situations, that, you know, the kind of emotions that people typically feel in relation to different scenarios, and the different kinds of coping strategies that people may have, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think I do draw it on it quite a lot. There's a couple of questions from our audience, so I would love to jump in and bring them into our discussion. So Kingsley Pearson, who actually, Mick, was at our event in Cambridge, our original event in Cambridge. So hi, nice to see you again, Kingsley.
Hello, Kingsley.
And congratulations, Kingsley, on your recent, I think you had a competition success, I think, didn't you? So congratulations on that. So Kingsley asks, does the panel have, from the perspective of their different disciplines, any comments on or insights into, here we go, it's a biggie, the psychology of the publishing industry? Either individual sections such as agents, editors, marketing, booksellers, etc., or the system as a whole. I'm going to throw this one to Gabriella, because you analyze organizations and teams within organizations, right? So do you want to give us your psychoanalytic formulation of the publishing industry?
I'll give you something. I don't know if it'll be as clear as a formulation. That's a huge and very interesting question. I don't know how coherent I can be, Philippa and Kingsley, but I will say the bits of insight that I've got. I mean, one insight, well, I'm kind of got snippets. One is that it's the agents now who hold risk. Publishers won't take risk anymore, so the agents have to hold all the risk. And I think psychologically it's interesting when you think of how people hold things for other people, or in an organization, one department might hold something for the whole organization. I think that in publishing, agents hold quite a lot of that unpaid for as well risk that publishers have kind of rid themselves of to a very large extent. That's one thing.
One sec, hang on. Give me 1 sec.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I think another thing is that the publishing industry is, in my experience of it, I mean, I think it's an industry like every industry that is in a difficult time and has had a difficult time with COVID, etc. But I think it's an industry where there's an inbuilt nature to kind of keep on for the next thing. So I've realised that as an author on the receiving end of that, it's kind of built into the process that you're never quite satisfied, because they tell you you've got, here's an example, they tell you they've just sold foreign rights to X country. And my reaction is, oh, fantastic. And then the agency is saying, so hopefully there'll be lots more to follow. And then I'm suddenly thinking, oh, so where are the others? When am I going to hear about the others? So there's always a push for, and the next thing, and the next thing. So there's something it means that you are constantly in a state of hope and constantly in a state of potential disappointment. And I suspect that goes through the whole industry. Shall I say more? Is that enough?
Yeah. Look, like I'm just lapping this up. So I think, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm on like tenterhooks. I'm like, this is gold dust. Like, please keep going.
I don't know what else I can say. Now my thoughts have run away.
Sorry, I was really interested in what you said about the idea of agents holding risk. And obviously risk means different things in different contexts. We're not, for example, talking about risk of someone committing suicide generally, which would be when we're in the clinical setting, that might be what we mean by risk, for example. But how do you define the risk, and from your understanding, what does it mean when one person or one part of an organization is holding something for the others, or more specifically holding risk for the others? What are these sort of implications of that? What does that do for them, for others, for the authors? What does that mean?
I think when I'm talking about risk, I'm talking about business risks.
Yeah.
So of course publishers take risks in that then when they buy a manuscript, when they agree to take it from an agent, they're still taking a risk as to whether it will actually sell well or not. But I think the level of risk is far more limited from what I understand than it used to be. They take more of a gamble in days gone past than they will now. So it's the agents who, they receive all the manuscripts, they put time, all unpaid, into reading manuscripts and deciding, so they're not getting a penny for that. And then they take, so that's one risk, that they're doing all of that work for free. They might take the author on and they haven't sold it to a publisher yet, so they don't know if they're going to make a penny out of it. And I think the publishers have kind of pushed away a lot of that to agents now. I think one of the implications is that there's a kind of one is, I suspect it's even harder than it used to be to get into the system, because the agents are very much the gatekeeper for the publisher, perhaps even more than they used to be. So that's one implication of the system, where somebody does something, or some bit of the system does something for another bit, then one part of it is relieved and another part of it has to hold it all. I mean, I think publishing must be really hard for everybody, and certainly is for the authors, but I think it must be for everybody working in it, and maybe particularly for agents, because they're kind of like this middle person, and they do, I think, relieve publishers of some of that. They are also now, I think they're expected to get, before they even submit to publishers, they might do quite a lot of work with the author to get it ready. Again, they've got no money from that at all. So they do the unpaid work in the hope that they'll get something. The publishers, of course, do unpaid work, and they pay in advance, so they've even given the author some money before they get into the publishing process. But their level of gambling is much reduced. They're fairly confident that this is going to sell. They may, it's not scientific and they may get it wrong, but it's far less risky. So they're relieved of some of that anxiety. And the agents carry that, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers you, Philippa.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just seeing a comment from Melissa in the chat saying Andrei Schifrin wrote a book quite a while ago now about the publishing industry in the US that has stuck with me, more of a focus of the push for successful writers to come out with a book a year or even more often, knowing it will sell. Unfortunately, as the books are not revised and edited enough, many of us give up on that series or writers. Is this the case in the UK? There was a bit of a question at the end there as well. I mean, I suppose I don't know, from your experience, Mick, as well, my experience is my publishers would like me to bring out a book a year, and that's kind of generally what I work on. I wouldn't do more than that. And actually, with my third book, I made a complete pig's ear of it, and the whole thing went in the bin. So they didn't get a book from me at all that year. And it was fine. They were totally fine with it. So I don't think there's, I mean, I don't think it's a make or break, basically. What are your thoughts, Mick? Maybe both in terms of Melissa's question there, but also more generally about any hot takes on the publishing industry as a social psychologist.
Well, in terms of Melissa's comment, I was also on that sort of, for the Arrowwood books anyway, a book a year. And, you know, if you have to support yourself, I mean, most writers don't earn enough to support themselves on. So most novelists have got other jobs. And which means that when you are put on a sort of schedule of a book a year, it can be very difficult to do that. And it may be that your first book took you 3-4 years to write, because you kept going over it and over it, and you don't really have that luxury for your second and third books. And yeah, I also found that my editors were fine with me, because I never hit the deadline for my books, and they were fine. But had I let it drift on for a further year, it might have become problematic. There are some publishers and some crime authors particularly who are on 3 books a year. And that is, yes, I won't say the publishers' names, but I know writers who are on that sort of schedule. And I don't see how, you know, I certainly couldn't, you know, I couldn't even write 3 chapters in that time. But yeah, and going back to the psychology of the publishing industry, I think just to sort of add on to Gabriella's comments, I mean, I think the thing to remember is that each person in the chain has an identity to protect, and they're all within their little power structures, and they are answerable to somebody above them. Agents, they look like they're working on their own, but actually, if they submit 2 books to an editor in a row and the editor doesn't want to buy either of them, suddenly their reputation goes down.
Yeah.
And their next submission is going to be seen as less enticing for that editor. And if word starts to get around that the agent is submitting a lot of things and they're not being bought, then, you know, it's going to make it harder for their next lot of submissions. So there's a lot of sort of reputational pressure on everybody within a publishing house. Junior editors want to be promoted to senior editors, and senior editors want to be promoted up to managing editors. And you see a lot of people jumping around from publishing house to publishing house. And you know, I think for editors, they want, you know, if they can get one success a year, one really good success a year, then that allows them to sort of make a case for promotion or to move to a better job somewhere else. But to get that success often depends on getting your books into Tesco's, or getting a big promotion paid for by your publishing house on Amazon. And all of that stuff is not a given, you know, and it requires, you know, to having some heft in the marketing meetings and all that stuff. And again, all that stuff depends on your reputation as well, and your identity and your networking abilities and things like this. Getting a quote from a really famous author on the front of your book may well mean you can get that book into Smith's or into Tesco's, whereas the same book without the quote from Ian Rankin or someone may not get anywhere near the supermarket. So you know, all of that stuff comes into it. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to think, you know, the more you get exposed to that, the more you think, oh, so that's how these things work. You know? Obviously, you've got to write a great book to start off with, but there's lots of great books written that don't make it in the way other books do because of all those sort of things that go on behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Can I just add something, Philippa? Because I was pushing how agents carry the risk, and Mick, I totally agree with you. They have to protect their reputation, and as authors, we need them to have good reputations. So, but actually, I also thought I don't want to give the impression that editors don't take any risks. And I had an example with one of my chapters, which is controversial. It's called Difference and Discrimination. So, of course, it's controversial. And I got, before it went out, I got a very negative reaction, and I got quite panicked by it. And I think my editor got quite panicked by it. And then my editor said to me, look, this is always going to be a controversial chapter. You and I just have to be happy. You know, we need to be solid that we're happy with the way it's written. And I thought, oh, thank you. Because she was standing behind me. And I realized in a chapter like that about race, difference, you know, if it got a bad hit in the press, the editor's going to be in for it. So of course good editors take those kind of risks. It is a very exposing industry in the way that Mick was saying about their reputations and ours, of course. I think it's full of exposure. And that's part of the psychology, people dealing with the exposure, protecting with, against it, or just reacting to it, or just dealing with it.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Gabriella, and what you were saying, Mick. And it was interesting what you were saying about the exposure. If you write a controversial chapter or book that lands badly, yours obviously hasn't. I don't remember there being something in your book that I was like, oh my God, what? I mean, I just found it all really interesting. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's like, anyway, but it's interesting. I was just struck by what you said about editors taking the flack for that. And actually, I'm not sure how much editors do. I'm thinking about, you know, some of the high profile cases we've had of authors being criticized for things they've written. And I don't think we ever, like, do we know who their editors are? I'm not sure. I mean, that cuts both ways, in that, you know, so much of our, you know, bringing a book into its shape and making it the best it is, you know, our editors play a huge part in that, but they're not, you know, they don't really get any credit for that, and unless we put them in our acknowledgements. And I sometimes think, but no, it's really interesting, that sense of, you know, reputation. And I was thinking, one of the things I think about a lot in terms of the publishing industry, and this is probably more from the author's side, but actually given our discussions just now, I'm sure this is going to be the case for agents and editors and everybody else, is that there's kind of two features of being published that are so difficult for us as humans. One is uncertainty or lack of predictability. You know, A plus B doesn't necessarily equal C in publishing, you know, and also lack of control, which are kind of similar but not quite the same. And I talk a lot to kind of aspiring authors or kind of new authors in their careers about doing everything that you can to minimize uncertainty and maximize your sense of agency and control. And that might be, you know, if you don't know information, get the information, ask questions, be informed about stuff, do the research, you know, ask your agent, whatever it is. Or a bit like we were talking about, Gabriella, before we came on air, you know, if there's something that you want to happen and someone else isn't going to do it yourself, you know, or push for something yourself, speak up, take the ball into your own hands. Is that not quite the right metaphor? Do you know what I mean? And I think, because I think that as human beings, you know, going back to basic threat response and survival, If we don't know what or where the threat is, that's very terrifying and stressful. If we know where the threat is, we can feel more able to deal with it. So we don't like the unknown, we don't like unpredictability. And not having control is also very threatening, because if we don't have control over a situation, we can die in that situation. So lack of control and uncertainty are very inherently very stressful for us as human beings. So anything we can do to minimize those things will make us feel more sane on a publishing journey. We've got some other great questions. So I'm on the spoil for choice here. I'll try and just think about the order we could do things. Okay, I will come back to that one from Elaine. That might be something nice to finish up on. Melissa asked a question saying, it seems in part from panel 1, and we mentioned it again just now, that many of the books written that include psychology in some ways are mysteries or maybe thrillers. I know a lot of people who write sci-fi and or fantasy. Have you heard of or seen any books that are the latter, but also include psychological ideas? That's really interesting. I don't know. I don't read a lot in that genre, and probably because I don't write in that genre either, I don't know a lot of fantasy or sci-fi authors. But yeah, I mean, do you guys have any thoughts about, you know, whether there's anyone in the kind of psychology field or any books in that area that clearly draw quite strongly on psychological concepts?
I'm afraid I don't read sci-fi or fantasy, although I do love it on the screen. I find really interesting that there's been a few films or some TV series about human beings when we have androids who look very, very much like humans and act like humans, really good quality androids. And I've always really found that interesting, how they explore the psychology of how does a human relate to an android like that, and at what level of relationships they might have with the androids. And the sort of problems that arise as a result. So that's the closest that I can think of. But I'm sure Melissa has got some ideas of this about herself.
What about you, Gabriella?
I can't add to that. I don't read that sci-fi or fantasy either, actually. So no, sorry, I don't know.
I was thinking about a little bit, well, two things really. One is, again, you know, I was blethering on about the hero's journey before being a kind of core story structure model. And it's kind of so inherent in, particularly in kind of fantasy books. I'm thinking about things like Lord of the Rings, you know, those kind of epic, heroic stories, right? I know that, what George Lucas, you know, the director for the Star Wars films, you know, he studied, I think, was it Joseph Campbell's book on craft called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he basically developed this idea of what he called the monomyth. And this was from studying loads and loads and loads of stories in different cultures, you know, folklore, religious story of Jesus, the story of you know, the witch in the woods, all of these things. And he found the commonalities between them, and he brought that together into a theory about basically the hero's journey. And then George Lucas studied that really, really, really closely when he was writing the Star Wars films. And that's a huge part of why they're so successful, is because they hit these beats so well that seem to be really, they just really resonate with us as humans in the process of storytelling. So I think sometimes those kind of books have really done that kind of storytelling really, really well. And the other thing I was thinking about is, you know, going back to what you were saying, Mick, about, you know, speculative fiction. I think whether it's about AI or whether it's about other kind of changes to our world, I think they are, maybe this is more, I don't know which direction you see the kind of links, but I think those kind of books are so important in making us think about that question: what does it mean to be human? And if this changed in our world, how would we be different as humans? And if we had this biomechanism, you know, to read each other's minds or whatever. You know, I think those books are so good at really pushing the envelope of how we understand the human experience. So yeah, maybe
there's a great episode of Black Mirror, Charlie Booker's thing, where the premise is that you have something installed in your brain which films and memorizes everything. So it is your memory, but it actually remembers anything. And so at the moment, any conflict you have with somebody over, you know, particularly your partner, I didn't say that. Yes, you did say that.
Let's go back and check.
And what they were doing was, and so that you could project your memory onto a screen, and you could replay that argument, and you know, and the implications of that are incredible. You know, just imaginatively, you know, what on earth would transpire if that, which they dealt with really nicely, which is, you know, one of the great things about Black Mirror. It can do that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm putting a link to the Hero with 1,000 Faces book in the chat if any of you are interested in that. There's also a there's other books that have drawn on Joseph Campbell's work, because I think that Hero with 1,000 Faces is a bit of a, well, it's not an easy read narrative nonfiction, I don't think so. But it's a good sort of good kind of starting point for understanding that kind of stuff. Okay, next question. Jan Fish asks, any thoughts about the process of writing and how you might use self-psychology? So I guess, Jan, I'm thinking about, I guess what you're, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that what you're getting at is just kind of the work of being a writer and how we go about approaching our writing and how we cope with the things that writing or maybe being published throws up, like self-hatred, imposter syndrome, and these kind of things. Let me know if that's not quite what you meant by your question, and just drop a, oh yeah, Jan is saying yes, how do you get down to it? Okay, either of you got some top tips on how to actually get the writing done and not lose your mind when you're trying to write a book?
Yeah, I've got two. The first is from the theory of self-efficacy, which is a theory by somebody called Albert Bandura, who did the Bobo doll experiments. And this is the idea that it's very important to our ability to do tasks, to believe that we can do those tasks. And it's harder to believe that you can do a task which is really big than something which is very small. And sometimes, I mean, I'm sure all writers experience this, the idea of starting a new chapter, getting through that whole long scene that leads to the next chapter, can feel like a really monumental thing and quite overpowering. And sometimes you're just not up to that. You just don't feel, you know, it just seems too much. It is a truth that to be a novelist, you do have to approach it like a job and do it in the time, you know, set out the times you're going to do it. But sometimes the time comes and you just feel, oh no, this is overwhelming. You know, I've written 5 chapters and I've got another 35 to go. And the theory of self-efficacy says, well, if you just break that down and you forget about the 35 chapters and just think about, well, how are you going to start that next scene? If you sit down thinking, okay, I'm just going to start this next scene, it's so much easier to do than if you think about writing the whole scene or writing the whole book. So on those days when you are despondent and you just don't know where you're going to go, just think, okay, I just need to introduce this character. I just need to work out a nice way of starting the scene. And then that will get you going. And more often than not, once you've got that first paragraph written, the juices have started to flow a bit. So that
I guess even if they haven't, you can apply the same technique again and be like, okay, now just the next paragraph.
Yeah.
And then you've got 2 paragraphs where before you had no paragraphs. So
yeah, and 2 paragraphs are a day's work for some people.
Yeah. I've put a little link to some sort of simple introduction to that theory in the chat. That's I'm having flashbacks to writing a finals paper on that. I think something's coming back to me. What about you, Gabriella? Do you have any, you know, insights or advice in terms of, yeah, getting down to the business of writing sanely.
I can't quote any theories, I'm afraid, but I guess in a way it relates to what you were just saying, Mick. I think for me, there's something about if I really can't face whatever, that the next thing that I think I have to do, then it may be that I think, well, what can I face? If I can't do that, if I can't do A, can I do B? I don't know. Certainly in all that we are, I didn't write it sequentially. And sometimes I just went to where I felt I was psychologically, and then what I could approach psychologically. So that helped me a lot. Sometimes I think I always con myself a bit, and quite helpfully so, in that I don't quite allow myself to realise the full enormity of the project. I mean, you have
healthy denial.
Some healthy denial. You have to know it's a massive project, otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. But you don't quite have to know quite how massive it is, or at least I don't quite have to know all of the time. And sometimes I might use my own understanding of myself to think, why is this bit so difficult for me? What is it about this that I am finding so difficult? So I might use my self-knowledge to help me, or why am I now sabotaging myself by doing everything that I can to avoid this? And there's always a million things that you can do to avoid writing.
Yeah, like picking up fluff off the carpet by hand.
Yeah.
Sometimes it has to be done, and it's the priority. It's funny how much of a priority it's been.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question, Jan, and I think so one of the main therapy models that I work in is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. Basically, cognitive means cognitions, or in layman's terms, thoughts. Behavior is behavior, and therapy is kind of adjusting things to make things better, basically. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, we focus a huge amount on how our thoughts, our beliefs, our assumptions, our mindset will have a huge impact on our behaviors, our action choices. For a very simple example, if I'm thinking I can't do this, my behavior is more likely to be I avoid the task. If my thought is I can do this, my behavior is more likely that I'll engage with the task. A very simple example. So I think a lot about being really aware of thoughts that are helpful to me in getting down to my writing and coping well with the challenges of writing, and thoughts that are hindrances to that. And I suppose there's two things off the top of my head that I'm thinking about. One, which sort of Mick touched on really briefly, and which actually comes from a writer called Stephen Pressfield. So this is actually something that he talked about, and I just kind of put it into my CBT box in the way that I think about it. He talks about the concept of what he calls going pro. And what that basically means is shifting the mindset from I'm dabbling in writing, I enjoy writing, I write because I am creative and I like to explore ideas. And, when it's kind of flowing, I can get some great words down on the page. And shifting to a mindset which is just, I need to approach this like a job. It's a professional task I have to do. I don't get up in the morning for my day job and think, can I do it? Do I feel like it today? Oh, is the muse with me? Will it be good enough if I show up? Maybe I just won't bother. Maybe I'll be better in a week's time, or maybe it's not. You just do it. Even if you're not hugely confident or not in the mood, you just get up and you do it. So he talks about the idea of thinking of writing as just like grunt work, really. Like it's not this glamorous, fancy, creative thing. It can just be a bit like Mick saying, I just need to sit down and bash the words out, and I often think of it like words are maths. You know, if I write 200 words a day and I do that for X number of days, I will have X number of words. It's not rocket science. So the idea of kind of going pro and just shifting that mindset, then certain behaviors lead on to that. So when I kind of shifted into that mindset, it meant that there was no longer a choice about whether I wrote or not. I just had to do it. And I just, you know, there wasn't all this judgment about, was I going to be good enough, and what was I trying to, you know, should I write this or should I write that? And it was just, well, you know, if I don't feel like it, doesn't matter, I've just got to do it. So that was one thing, and I can find a link for that somewhere as well. And the other thing I think about is the curse of perfectionism. That again, if our mindset is, I have to write something really good, I can't put something on the page unless it reads really well, I don't want my first draft to be a mess, then it's really inhibiting, because we're just checking ourselves all the time, and it's very, very hard to do something really well at the first run up. You know, if you think about artists, painters, they do hundreds of sketches before they begin on a work. You know, they don't just paint, you know. Musician, they'll noodle, and it'll start to come together. So I think taking that, again, that thought process of just, I'm going to write shit. I'm going to write, and it's going to be shit, and it's fine, but at least it'll be written. And it doesn't matter, you know, it's better that it exists than it doesn't exist. So thinking about kind of what beliefs you're putting in place and your expectations of yourself in how you approach your writing, and shifting them into something that's more liberating, I would say. And some people are putting, oh, I think Elaine, you might have set that as a direct message, so you might want to see if you can send that message again. If you click the option to send it to everyone, but I'll read it out. Elaine says, she says, I lead timed prompt writing workshops. That helps us get started. So Jan, maybe you can link up with Elaine person and get on one of them. Okay, there's some other great questions. So here's one from Deborah Finn, which I think is a really nice one for us to think about. So she says, as psychologists or therapists, therapy people, you'll be aware of power in relationships and society, and how people can be harmed by problems in who holds power. Popular fiction often seems to reflect these power dynamics, and particularly psychological suspense, which will often have women being terrorized by men. Is it reasonable to explore these problems by mirroring them in fiction? Or as writers, do you feel you want to avoid reproducing those problematic power narratives? Such a good question, Deborah. I'm going to throw that to Gabriella first. Any thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Deborah. What an interesting question. I suppose, I mean, my attempted novel is too early to say quite what I do. I can't give a proper answer about what I do and don't do, but I suppose what I can say is, generally in writing, and that's certainly true of my non-fiction, I am challenging some of existing ideas and stereotyping. So I'm fairly confident that I will do that as well in my attempted novel. And I wouldn't want just to reproduce, or at least not reproduce without also some other perspective and some challenge to whatever is being reproduced, if that makes sense. So it's not just there as a given, but it might be there as an example of something that you then shine another light on it. So no, as a writer, I feel committed to trying to explore and think about things in society differently. That's part of my motivation.
Thanks, Gabriella. And what about you, Mick? What's your thoughts on that sort of dilemma in a way, or ethical question?
Well, writing crime fiction, this is a really important issue, and it's an issue that I've thought an awful lot about and wondered about. I initially started the Arrowwood books thinking I'm not going to write crimes where naked women are found having been sexually assaulted or raped, or there's no serial killer out there targeting women. I just didn't want to, personally, I didn't want to reproduce those stories. We have enough of those on television. And also, of course, you know, it's really difficult. You can't, at what point does, you know, do you acknowledge that you are actually reproducing narratives that will influence people to think in those ways as well? Not just criminals themselves, but actually, you know, it'll reinforce people to think about women in particular ways or men in particular ways by doing that. I know there's two views on this, because Val McDermott and other crime writers very strongly defend their right to write about those types of crimes. So I can definitely see it from both sides. The books that I wrote in Victorian London didn't deal with Jack the Ripper type crimes, although they could have done. But they did deal with crimes where oppressed groups are victimized. So my second book is about the exploitation of adults with learning disabilities. My third book is about four Zulus who come to Britain as a part of an ethnic exhibition, who are also being oppressed and exploited. So even though I haven't sort of used the sort of sexual serial killer stereotypes, I have been using stories of oppressed people being further oppressed, and I guess the way that I rationalize that is that this Victorian society at the time was extremely racist, and also had very low opinions of people with learning disabilities, and asylums were not nice places. So, you know, when you write, to a certain extent, you are trying to represent the times that you're writing about in a way that's authentic in some ways. So in those ways, you can't avoid it. But I guess, you know, I suppose that what I came to was that I was going to do that, but I was going to try and do it in such a way that the humanity of the individuals was, and the true humanity of the individuals was foregrounded, and that the reader would therefore get a sense of the fullness of those characters who maybe in previous times have been reduced to victims without much other characteristics, but I tried my best to try and portray those people as being fully human, with fully human relationships, with needs, with desires, and with traits that were valuable. And, you know, I tried to do that in a way that didn't seem that I was pushing any sort of particular message. So, you know, I guess my answer is to that question. I can see both sides, but it's really important to think your way through those as much as you can, and weave things into your story which are respectful.
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually, I don't know if you're aware, Deborah, that there was this question actually came up a few years ago when some authors, or I can't remember if it was an author. Anyway, someone launched a prize for crime books that didn't feature a female victim. And actually, one of the first things that was really interesting is nobody could think of one. Or it was like, who? But actually, then there was this really interesting debate, a bit like what Mick said, is that on the one hand, people saying we're using these lazy stereotypes and we're perpetuating the image of the woman as the victim, and also glamorizing the woman as a victim. You know, she's sprawled naked, you know, and, you know, ravished and naked, and that's the crime scene and things like that. On the other hand, authors were arguing, but that's real life, and we would be negligent if we weren't writing about the things that really do happen to people, particularly women. I'm just putting a little link to I think it was one of the newspapers that just covered the Staunch Prize. And I think I agree with you, Mick, that I think it's about how those stories are told. If they're told lazily, if they're told as if this is the status quo and it's fine that it's the status quo, and we even have a little bit of titillation about the status quo of women being assaulted, victims, etc., versus writing it to shine a light on it and basically call it out. And also, I think conversely, if we're going to write books in which that doesn't happen, we write them as holding them up examples of how our world could be and something for us to aim for, rather than as alternate universes, which is ignoring reality. So yeah, I think, and yeah, that links to what you're saying, Mick, isn't it, about making people characters, not blow up dolls. Sorry, that's a bit grim. So okay, we've got one more really nice question, which I think will be a really nice one for us to wrap up with, and this is the one from, where's it gone? Where's it gone? Wait, bear with me. How has it disappeared? Where's it gone?
Who's it from? Do you remember?
It was it from Elaine again? Anyway, it was basically, Mick, could you tell us a little bit more about Arrowwood? And could you also, Gabriella, tell us a little bit more about one of your particular case studies chapters? And could either of you read out a little section from one of your books even? I know we've caught you a bit on the hop there. Oh yeah, here we go, from Elaine. Yes, can we hear more about Mick's character? Can Gabriella give us an example of a chapter? Can you read short excerpts?
Wow.
Do you want to start?
Yes,
off by telling us? Yeah, tell us about Arrowwood.
Okay, a little bit about Arrowwood. Arrowwood is an ex-journalist who lives in Bermondsey, and he lives with his sister, who works for the mission, and his wife has left him, but she may return in one of the 4 books. I'm not saying if she will or not. And he works with a man called Barnett. Now Arrowwood is the son of a vicar, and not a well-off vicar, because a lot of vicars weren't well off. But his father was actually put into an asylum, so he has this haunting memory of going to see his father in the asylum and finding him in the lounge chained to a chair. So the ghosts of whether this will happen to him sort of haunt him. And he's the antithesis of Sherlock Holmes. So he is a coward. He is over emotional. He loves playing around with children. He's got lots of children in the neighborhood who love him, and sort of he gives them sweets, not in the bad way, by the way. Middle-aged man can
just avuncular.
Yeah, he's avuncular. And gradually throughout the books, he gradually accumulates this community of people who all seem to move into the 2 rooms he lives in behind a pudding shop. So gradually it becomes more and more overcrowded, and there's less space for him in it. And he's doing these very difficult cases, but he finds that the people around him start helping with the cases. So his sister often starts working on the case, and he uses Neddy, who's a sort of 8-year-old street boy, to help him on the cases. Barnett, his assistant, is a working class guy from the slums of South London, Jacob's Island slum, who Arrowwood sort of looks down on a bit, and Barnett resents him looking down, and they have these tussles quite often. So Arrowwood is a character very much within a social nexus, which develops over the course of the 4 books. So thank you for asking that question.
And I mean, if I will just ask Gabriella to tell us a little bit about one of her chapters. If you do have a passage you want to read out to us, Mick, I'll come back to you in a sec, give you a bit of chance to find something. If you don't have anything to hand, then don't worry. So Gabriella, yeah, tell us a little bit about one of your
Okay, I don't know,
your
I've
case
just
studies.
gone for, so my book is 3 parts. The first part, I think, as I said, is basically the fundamentals of human nature. The second part is how we lose ourselves, and the third part is how we find ourselves. So I'll tell you a little bit about chapter 3, which is not called the fundamentals of human nature, part 1. It's called Human Nature at Work. So chapter 3 is called Life and Death, and it's about an eating disorder service that I worked with, and during my time with them, they as a service died or were killed. They were closed down, and that it was terribly, terribly painful. And they were a fabulous team, did some excellent work, but got closed. And during the time, which is in the chapter, they lost their way. The anxiety got too much for them. The way they were treated got too much for them. And they went into what we think of psychoanalytically with teens. They went into what we know as a basic assumption state of mind, where they went into a bit of there are different basic assumptions, but this team at this point went into a fight-flight state of mind. Basic assumption in that unconsciously, you think that that's what you're there for. You forget that your job and your unconscious purpose becomes, in this case, to fight or flee from an enemy. It's very understandable. They got out of it and they ended up doing excellent work and closing down well as you can close. I hope that tells you a bit about the chapter. I'll read the opening 2 paragraphs very quickly, shall I?
Yeah, please do. That would be great. Yeah.
Appleby House stood at the end of a long gravel driveway with sweeping lawns on either side. I imagined Jane Austen's Emma looking down from a perfectly proportioned window, or strolling out of the dusky blue door and plucking a white rose rambling up the side of the entrance porch. Pauline, consultant psychiatrist and director, met me by the front door of the private residential service for children with eating disorders. Her face pale without makeup, her hair pulled back roughly. She told me a girl had jumped from the bedroom window while home for the weekend.
Yeah. That was the one that really stood out to me, because I used to work in eating disorders too, including for a while in an inpatient unit, and just so much of what you described was just so spot on. Yeah. What about you, Mick? Do you have a little excerpt you'd like to read to us?
I'll just read the first paragraph of the very first Arrowood book, which I haven't looked at for 6 or 7 years. Okay, so this is South London in 1895. The very moment I walked in that morning, I could see the governor was in one of his tempers. His face was livid, his eyes puffy, his hair, at least what remained on that scarred knuckle of a head, stuck out over one ear and lay flat with grease on the other side. He was an ugly sight, all right. I lingered by the door in case he threw his kettle at me again. Even from there I could smell the overnight stink of gin on his foul breath. Sherlock blooming Holmes, he bellowed, slamming his fist down on the side table. Everywhere I look, they're talking about that charlatan.
Brilliant. Okay, so we are going to wrap up just in a sec. I'm just sending Mira has just asked about some resources about cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm just sending a link for. Obviously, cognitive behavioral therapy is actually it's a kind of specialized therapy, but I'm going to send you some links to some self-help resources that cover a bunch of stuff, including procrastination, perfectionism, what were some of the other ones, assertiveness, and a few other things. So maybe just, I mean, these are more tailored for people who are struggling with their mental health rather than, you know, people in the writing field, but hopefully that will give you a little bit of an introduction to yeah, some of this stuff. So give me one sec. Boom, there you go. Guys, Mick, Gabriella, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic panel. One of the things I was slightly sort of anxious about in coming into this panel was how much we might end up just kind of repeating things that we discussed in previous panels. But actually, I think we've talked about completely different stuff, and it's been a real delight to have such fresh perspectives and discussions on things that we hadn't had before. And especially the little psychoanalysis of the publishing industry was so fun. So just to remind everybody, this is our final panel, but you can find the recordings of the 2 previous panels on my YouTube channel, which I'm just putting a link to in the chat. So Mick Finlay, just to remind you, is the author of the brilliant historical crime series with the protagonist Arrowwood, who you've just heard about. You can find more out about Mick and his books on his website, which is here. And Gabriella is the author of All That We Are, which is her narrative nonfiction book, which I highly, highly recommend. It's hugely informative. And we look forward to hearing, Gabriella, when your fiction novel is up and running. Oh, I just meant to say as well that Mick is also now working on a new book, which may be a standalone, maybe a new series. Watch this space, but that will be in the pipeline. So do please keep an eye out for his upcoming books as well. We have a page on bookshop.org of books of all the authors who've taken part across our 3 panels. And if you've enjoyed these sessions and you want to support the authors who've given up their evenings for free to speak with you, then please do check out their books. If you see any that you like, obviously the authors will be delighted if you buy a copy, or simply please just spread the word through friends and fellow readers that you have. So I'm just putting a little link to our bookshop page up there as well. And yeah, I think that's everything, guys. So just thank you so much. I will put the recording of this session up onto my YouTube channel tonight. So again, if there's anyone that that wasn't able to come tonight, but they'd like to catch up, then please do direct them there. So it really just remains for me to say goodbye to Oxford, goodbye to Cambridge. I feel like what's that guy on University Challenge? No, thank you so much, Mick and Gabriella. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Philippa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed it as well.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. I'll just have a quick check in with you too afterwards, but otherwise, good night, everybody. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming. It's been brilliant, and I'm going to stop the recording just about there.